Sim, welcome back to the show, brother.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no worries. It's been a real long time, man. You and Stuart pulled up on episode 100, and now here you are on 104. So happy to have you back as an individual.
Thank you. That was a good dialogue, so I'm glad to be invited back so we can go deeper into whatever you had in mind.
Yeah, 100%. Stuart just sort of bullied you the whole time and took the floor and just won't shut up. And no, I'm kidding. Stuart's awesome,
Mhm.
but yeah, I wanted to hear more from you, man. You're kind of an interesting dude. So for those who might have missed episode 100, why don't you give us a quick background? Because you're an interesting guy, man. You're not easily pegged in one category. So why don't you give everybody the quick background, the
Yeah.
quick bio?
So, I mean, the difficult to peg me also has to do with that my background is quite diverse. Um, so when I started out, it was basically when I like my coaching came from my own health journey, right? So that's kind of like where things started. And in that, like, it was, I mean, we're talking like 15-ish years ago, maybe 16, right? So that's quite some time ago. Back then, especially if you're younger, the internet was a very different place. You didn't have the same access to information one has now. A lot of it was scattered. I mean, like, when I look back, I was just operating on very basic information, right? So, like, when I got started, YouTube hadn't even come out yet, right? That was like 2014 or something, if I remember correctly. I can't be wrong, but I thought it was somewhere around there, right? So, like, I started a few years before that, 2010. And then I was reading, muscle magazines or like muscle and health or like muscle fitness,
It was like
something.
muscle health and fitness. Wasn't that like that
Yeah,
Bill? What Bill? God, he was from Colorado. I can't remember the
it,
name of the
it
guy, but he
might be
was
that one, Men's Health, because
man.
that was like the magazine back in the day, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah. I was in that same boat too, man. I used to read magazines. I was thinking when you were
yeah,
talking about YouTube and stuff, like I used to read fucking magazines
yeah,
to try
yeah.
to get my information. It was crazy.
So that's, like, I also didn't grow up in an environment where a lot of this stuff was readily available. Um, so like growing up in Belgium, around Antwerp, it's not like there wasn't anything that was like fitness, health, and bodybuilding, but it was just not a scene that I was even closely related to. Um, the like additionally, because it's like a bit of a cultural thing as well. Like a lot of the mindset or perception around the health and stuff like that was very derogatory, right? Like there weren't a lot of good opinions about this. People thought that you were a loser if you did
Oh,
that
like
type of stuff.
culturally, like
Yeah,
culturally, it wasn't thought of well.
yeah. Um,
Mm.
it's much better now, but I remember back in the day, like if you were into health and bodybuilding or training, then you were like not just weird, but yeah, it was just you're a very like an almost antisocial type of person, to put it like that. You're like that's not what we like here, you know.
That's
So
weird because like it
mm,
feels to me like it's that way now. Like you see all these articles now. Like
yeah,
if you're into health and fitness and nutrition, you're like a right wing Nazi.
uh,
Which, which I'm like, what is that about?
it's very odd how that script has flipped. But yeah, so that's kind of the environment that I grew up in. And then effectively, was dealing with a lot of my health challenges, and I just kind of had to find my way through these things, right? Somewhat successfully, somewhat unsuccessfully, a lot of failed or bad experiments. So it was just, yeah, kind of bouncing from one thing to the next. Because like my inclination was never really into like strength training or even like physical training. I was sort of into sports, rugby. I did some taekwondo. I did Krav Maga later down the line, the Israeli defense system. So it was just kind of, yeah, I've been all over the place, and then like I just kind of really had to. Uh, yeah, find my way through what felt right for me, but then also starting to put the puzzle pieces together that it was not just the physical thing, right? Like there was much more psychologically or emotional or even spiritual that came into this entire equation. And that's kind of how the ball got rolling, where I was like, oh, there's another thing here, another dimension or another level or another angle that I wasn't aware of before. And it's kind of like you just keep building and yeah, integrating these things.
Got it. And so, is it safe to say that your interest in neuroscience sort of stemmed from your original health and fitness journey and
Yeah,
overcoming your health issues?
100%. Because I don't have a formal education. So like everything that I've learned that I use today and that I write about, that's all been like self education through books, articles, podcasts. I read a ton of research papers, a ton. So over this amount of time, like I really started getting into neuroscience like around 2018 or something. Around that time, where I was like, you, I'm never gonna like claim that I maxed out my knowledge on these other fronts, but I was kind of like, I feel like I'm not really like I'm not really seeing things clearly. There must be other things that are blocking either me or other people that don't make a lot of sense at that particular dimension, right? And as the saying goes, when you have a hammer, everything is a nail. So,
Yeah.
and I noticed that like I already had different tools in terms of breathwork, meditation, and stuff like that. But why does that work, right? It's just everyone's just kind of like, yeah, this feels good, or it works, or I feel better, or this happened, and I'm like, yeah, okay, that doesn't tell me anything about the mechanism. It doesn't tell me why this happens or why you felt this way, but another guy doesn't feel this. Like let me just put it like this: I was very confused, and like I couldn't really make heads or tails of things, either within my own experience or the experience of other people. And then I just had to kind of like figure out where these things came from or how they connect.
That's really cool, and your journey sort of mirrors mine. And it's interesting the way that there's that saying that the people don't have ideas, ideas have people.
Yeah, yeah.
There's something about
Mm,
different topics that grips people, and I think that's why you're interesting to me, why Stewart's interesting to me, is that there's something odd about us. There's something different. You have to kinda be a weirdo to be into this stuff, and I totally
yeah.
vibe with that, man.
Mm,
But I think that you and Stewart both are a lot further down that rabbit hole than me. I think I'm
mm,
interested in like, a lot more things grip me, like, in
mm.
different areas. I'm ADD as hell. I'm all over the map. But I want to learn more about this, right?
Yeah,
I've got the effective neuroscience textbook. Jaak Panksepp
awesome. Yeah,
is the OG, um,
exactly.
and I spend tons of time, looking at stuff on YouTube and whatnot.
Mm,
But I don't feel like I've given it adequate
mm.
attention. I think it's just kind of like a side quest for me, and so I
Yeah,
want to go
yeah.
down that rabbit hole more. So I want you to tell me, like, teach me today, man. Like, what are some of the most important things that you've learned about neuroscience and how that sort of Venn diagram overlaps with overall human health?
Um, man, like that's a it's very expansive. So like the there are a few levels to this. I'm gonna try to outline them to the best of my ability. So the main thing that I've learned, so everyone in fitness kind of has the n equals one, right? Like my experience is my experiment, and we can kind of put it like that, where whatever I do works for me. So when we look at that on a neuroscientific level, that's because you have so many different bio individual differences in neural architecture. I'm writing a book about this right now because I really wanted to kind of like play with this and build something around that. So at the one level, we have what I call encoding profiles, which already comes from neuroscience, right? Encoding is how I process information, store information, synthesize information, and then I would argue how you express that. So that's another level to it, and they come in like the way I kind of structured it, and it's not an absolute. It's just kind of like to give somebody an orientation or a direction, right? So a lot of these things that I use are in in that way because I like to make things practical, make them as scientifically robust as possible, but still like now it's easy to understand. So it kind of goes from low fidelity to high fidelity. Just meaning that a low fidelity encoder would be someone that doesn't experience certain things at a very high level, meaning that like they don't see images, for instance, right? They have aphantasia, or they don't have a monologue, or they don't experience awe with certain things. And that's kind of where I put like low fidelity encoders because it's a spectrum, like a bell curve, like everything is, right? And then you have people with like more latent capacities that are undeveloped. We could call that tier one. Tier two would be, okay, I have some of these to a certain extent. That would be tier two. And then I call tier three the hyper fidelity encoders, right? So people like me, super visual, um, a lot of this, like my inner dialogue or monologue, it can go in like up and down. I've done a lot of work with that as well. But just to make the case that it's not just one voice, it can differentiate into many voices. It can come back down. Um, very sensitive to the environment, sensitive to dopamine things, landscapes, women, like beautiful art, like you name it, right? So that's like a very high fidelity. The um, what I call like richness, right? So reality for me is very rich. It's very layered into these different aspects that filter through all of these neurological, what is it? The entire neurological architecture, right? So how these different brain areas are connected, my genetic dispositions towards dopamine, for instance, how the brain areas communicate, how my brain hemispheres communicate. So all of these things kind of come together in this way. So that would be like one of the major things that I've been playing with, learning about, understanding where these things come from, and then where I would argue that makes it practical is the separation for people and how they deal with emotions. Because whatever I just said that I like I aimed at externally, that was like an external thing that we were talking about, but that also um, applies internally, where I have a very rich internal environment and I can differentiate in many different layers. So there's a point to be made, and they converge these 2 points that when you have something called like dendrite branching, it branches out like multiple levels in different brain areas. So it's a little bit more complex than the way I'll explain it, but it sets us up to understand this, where the more layers of this branching that you have, the more complexity the brain has, then the more dimensions it has access to in layers of thinking, but also layers of experience. And when you put these things together, then it gives us a pretty good outline why some people have very rich experiences, even with mundane things, and some people see reality as like a 2D thing. It's like it's just there's this thing and it's kind of monotone and that's it.
You're describing NPCs.
Well, yeah. Essentially. So the argument, there is an argument here, maybe not the argument, because I want to be very careful with how I frame things, that you have some people that like from the literature, right? And that I just kind of see, at least like online from things that people express, that are just at like what I call tier zero. Like they don't really encode all that much. They don't really have that ontological connection with reality. And then I think a lot more people find themselves in a category where they actually haven't spent as much time and effort and resources in developing some of these latent capacities. And it's that also has to do with like everything, that like goes on in the brain in terms of vasoconstriction, so like blood vessels contracting, or vasodilation, so opening thereof, inflammation, stress, micronutrient imbalances, different levels of deprivation of oxygen, other nutrients, you name it, right? So all of these things have to come together in order to kind of dictate what the brain gets or doesn't get access to.
Got it. And so I want to back up a little bit because you
Yeah.
skim past something that I think is super important and that
Uh-huh.
weirds me out a whole bunch. When you
Hmm.
start studying neuroscience and you
Hmm.
start trying to conceptualize myself. What am I?
Hmm.
You are quickly hit with a stark realization that you are not one thing, and
Hmm.
that internally you are made up of multiple different things that are sort of independently operating,
Hmm.
that are essentially orchestrated and sort of synthesized by our higher level cognitive
Yeah.
functioning, right? That sort of takes all of these micro selves and sort of amalgamates them into one thing called Brent or Sim,
Hmm.
and we sort of have self-referential processing
Yes.
that happens in the default mode network, right?
Hmm.
And so, to me, that's super weird because like for example, you probably are familiar with the experiments they've done with the corpus callosum, where they've severed that in
Hmm.
individuals, and you start realizing that not only do you have two separate selves in the hemisphere,
Hmm.
but you have two separate selves that once that connective tissue or that communication between the hemispheres is severed, they actually are in opposition to each other. They can actually fight with each other,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
that's just at the macro scale. And I think
Yeah. Yeah.
internally, you like at the
Mhm.
micro level, there's all of these different programs that run. That's a freaky thing to think about, man. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Um, yeah, good question. Again, like it's still a point of learning for me, and I try to like kind of conceptualize that like from different angles, but I can't say that I've come with a very good synthesis of that yet. Or I haven't come with any synthesis, let's say, that diverges from what other people have said, like Stewart, right? Where you have a on top of the hierarchy this amalgamation, as you called it, right? Like this thing that completely encapsulates everything, kind of binds it together, and that I would use the term harmonizes or aligns all of these nested consciousness in the entire vertical dimension, right? Like from the micro to the macro, all the way. Um, what's doing that is another question. Like I like it that's kind of like, and I'm smiling because I just think it's fascinating. 'Cause I don't know. It's very cool to hear Carl Friston, the neuroscientist, or Mark Solms talk about these, and you know they converge on certain aspects, and how that all comes together. But outside of that, like I really have nothing else to add to that. Like I think it's one of these, it's almost miraculous in a way, right? That your consciousness not just emerges, but does form a synthesis of all these different conscious elements or minds or, you know, processes that have their own self-referential systems. And then, ta-da, here you are, right? As a psyche, as a mind, or as Stewart called it, like you as the attractor state as an identity, which is very cool, right? Like you're just everything still keeps gravitating towards this sense of self. But yeah, that's
Yeah,
what I have.
it feels like trying to manage a circus. You know, like experientially for me, you know, and I'm trying to tie this back to your original sort of thoughts about how this impacts health and stuff, because I think there's
Yeah.
a lot, particularly around the dopaminergic system,
Mhm.
um, and managing impulse control and people that tend to overeat or have other unhealthy behaviors, right? There's all of these. That's just one example, but we have all of these poles and all these drives and all these little micro personalities that the prefrontal cortex or whatever the orchestrator is,
Mhm.
sort of keeping them aligned, seems to have to keep in check all the time. And that's a very weird thing to think about, and I don't know if people actually think about it in that way, but that's really what people in the self help space are trying to do. They're trying to help people manage their, you know, they call them demons or they call whatever they, you know, I got to fight
Yeah.
your demons. Like, no, these are just like internal states that are, you know, these little micro consciousnesses or micro, I don't know if they're programs. I don't even know what these things are. I've
Mhm.
had some very weird psychedelic experiences where I've been able to sort of like view these things as they operate within me. And they do feel almost like embodied spirits to some degree, to use a lack of a better term. You know, I'm an atheist. I don't really believe in woo woo stuff, but that was what the subjective feeling felt like, that like these things are in me,
Mhm.
but they're not limited to me. It's like they pass along through the genome, they pass along
Yeah.
over time, and they sort of, metaphysically just embody people as they go through. And that's just it's just a weird thing subjectively to think about. And it really freaks me out. Like this is maybe why I avoid super deep dives in neuroscience, because every time I
Yeah.
start going to the rabbit hole, it starts freaking me out a little bit.
It's very aligned or convergent with the work of Jung in terms of archetypes and
Mm.
what he outlined or saw from the original Greek literature, that like what they're talking about mainly is these different, as you said, like aspects, right? Archetypes, but drives of behavior. Plato had the tripart division of the soul with the appetitive part, the spirited part, and then the rational part, which was a more simplified version of the amount of different things you have, conflicting drives that you have to kind of align, right? Like, in that, indeed, like there's an even like a fascinating what is it, like a line you can draw from there, extrapolating that, like, you actually see as you go through neurodevelopmental phases how that complexifies, but one becomes more dominant than the other. And that's also very interesting because if we have all these archetypes available, right, as you were talking about, that are both within us and without us or outside of us, then they kind of all get their heyday, so to say, where it's like, oh yeah, now we're in this phase, and you see more of this, and you see in young guys, especially when you're in your 20s, it's kind of dominated by the warrior archetype, right? High dopaminergic, just drive, um, which you could see in other maybe like more mythological archetypes and how that was like divided over other cultures or something similar. So just to affirm or like add to your point that clearly, right, that is not that's very universal, and then it's been expressed in different narratives, but all the, let's say, mythological processes overlap and align with the neurological processes almost one to one, right? There's divergences always somewhere, right? But they're basically the same.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's so important to tell the truth and be open with
Mhm.
other people. Cause I think there's so much shame with people. I think people like to think that whatever those quote unquote demons are, or whatever the things they're wrestling with or they're trying to control or whatever, that's unique to them. Like they're the only person that's suffering from this. And if you realize that, like, no, we're all cut from the same genomic cloth. Like we
Yeah.
all have the same archetypes embedded with us. And if we talked about them openly, I think that we would all be better off as a society. There seems to be. I think this is where like social media bothers me a lot. Is that
Yes.
there
Mhm.
seems to be this state where everybody simultaneously wants to attack somebody on the line. They want to find some fault in somebody,
Yeah, yeah.
attack them viciously for it, and at
Mhm.
the same time, what they're doing is sort of hiding back like, "Ooh, if I do that, maybe they won't come after me," right? Because
Yeah.
if I'm attacking somebody, maybe people won't see, the
Mhm.
things that I'm wrestling with and dealing with, and I
Yeah.
think it's a super toxic, sort of paradigm that we've developed, and
Mhm.
it's just sad to see, honestly, because I see social media as having so much incredible power to do good, and my god, we are just like monkeys ripping it all to shreds. It's not good.
There's several aspects to this. Like, first of all, like, I've been working with that with people as well. I mean, with clients, and like when I talk about it with friends as well. That when you have like, I made a dimensional representation of your different types of selves, but more in an attachment sense, not in nested consciousness. Again, like to make things simple. I don't remember the outline from memory, but one of them was like your digital self is just a representation. But the reason why I bring that up is, as you said, because when, and I feel this way, but I mean, again, like it's very aligned with the like neuroscience, neuropsychology. When that image of yourself diverges very strongly from who you actually are, and it's always a representation thereof, right? So there's going to be some disconnect, just to be clear and concise. But the further that divide is, the more splitting you have, where you're like, oh, I kind of have to keep this persona of me alive and but you are starting to, well, and that's why I said the word splitting, right? You're starting to split your sense of self in certain ways. Maybe a good representation of that, as an analogy, is how people are like social chameleons. They effectively adjust their presentation of self as, depending on the person that they're with, right? That's social chameleonism in that sense. So, like, if they meet 5 or 6 different people, they are a different person with each one of them, which in a lot of ways is a lack of integrating a lot of whatever these factors or aspects of personality into, general behavior. That also has like more background into trauma stuff, right? So it's not just a personality type thing. It's definitely not. Even when some people have more of a propensity towards. Just to make the point that the same type of thing is happening online, and that's like it's kind of akin to the same thing that you said about like, well, if you don't whine, and that's like living in truth in a way, right? If I can align this presentation, digitally, and just online, or online, online is digitally, but I meant to say with people in general, socially, across whatever board, and then I'm coming as close to that core of self without deviating too far from it, right? There's an aspect of this where your your roles are sort of different anyway, right? You kind of act differently with your mom than you do with your partner, than you do with your sister.
Sure,
So
sure.
you always have multi-aspectualization or a multi-aspectual self anyway. And that's kind of coming back to that, like the attractor state, right? There is a core of identity, but that to me is a lot more based on integration. So the more of these things that I can integrate, the stronger or more robust that core is, the more I can like, I would put it, the less contact I lose with who I think I am or really am, and can represent that behavior. And if my role changes, it's not like my entire personality changes or what I like or dislike. You see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, it reminds me of since you brought up Jung, it's the shadow, right? It's
Yeah.
the confrontation with the shadow, and I think that
Hmm.
unless people have done that,
Hmm.
they can't really understand who they authentically are, at least as close as they're
Yes.
capable of understanding. And as
Hmm.
Jung pointed out, is until you make the what is it, the unconscious conscious,
Yeah.
it's going to direct your life, and you're going to call it fate.
Yeah. And a part of this, like, is also attachment based. So attachment to me, right? This is my own conceptualization. I'm not going to say that it's again an absolute thing, but you have 3 orientations. I have the orientation towards myself, the orientation towards other, but that's anything, right? You can split other into people and inanimate objects. And then you have the world or reality, God, the universe. That is its own thing. But when we're talking about these archetypes, when we're talking about integration of the shadow, like those are all aspects of attachment, like how I am attaching or relating to myself at this dimension. But when we also tie that to the digital aspect or the online aspect, a lot of this behavior that you were talking about that has to do with people attacking you, I think is also a sign of the lack of attachment and integration in themselves, but also like horizontally, like me and you, me and somebody else, you and somebody else. It doesn't matter, right? Like before, tribes or societies and cultures were structured in a way where you were the horizontally and vertically integrated into that society, right? You had some political influence to a certain extent, depending on where you were in time and space. But we could argue that the most healthiest, you know, um, models of this were the ones where that was indeed the case. And then the further you like move from people, the further you move from a political system, the further you move from anything, right? The more disconnect you have, the easier it becomes to attack someone for whatever, right? And in the health space, as you've mentioned before many times as well, like on the other podcasts of yours, that that's a really big thing now, right? Like people will attack you for, even if you have a lot of overlap, you just have to get the narrative wrong on how something works, and then you get demolished. So, and that to me is like, that's generally people that like don't have any, connection with each other or any real like integration in other ways that we've just been talking about.
Yeah, and I think that is a sign of deep insecurity in a lot of people.
Hmm.
I think that people tend to gravitate towards ideas in a
Hmm.
tribal sense, in a tribal meaning like this is my group,
Yeah.
and therefore the idea becomes sort of like dogma. Like
Yeah.
we have this rigid dogma in our group.
Hmm.
We're the carnivores, and if we
Yeah.
have fruit, then oh my god, right? And then we're going to attack because it's
Yeah.
not necessarily about the fruit or deviating. It's like this is my tribe, this is my safety, and I think
Yeah.
you might be right. Like people that tend to lash out the most are
Mhm.
probably people that have broken attachment. I think if you've studied attachment theory, it's pretty clear that a lot of people have broken attachment. Me too. I had a terrible childhood, and I see that manifest in those types of discussions.
Yeah. And like that's also like when you go into the effective neuroscience studies. I mean, you're already working or reading the source of effective neuroscience, right? You can see that like the sense of self gets formed by two aspects. The first one is individuation. That's when the child um like starts realizing that you're a different entity than the mom, right? That
Mhm.
happens very early on, around what was it, 0 to 2 years. So somewhere around the development
Well,
into
hold
your
on. Like, that's a long time when you think about it. Like, people always
yeah.
skim past it. I'm like, hold on a second. It's really important to know that
Oh,
as a like the mother and the baby are essentially a system for at
yeah,
least 2 years of the first,
yeah.
development, which is wild to think about.
Well, it is wild. It's one of these things where we don't give biology enough credit, I believe, right? Like generally, where if you understand that, like as you said, the mom and the baby are an entire unit, and even more crazy that like neurons from the baby end up in the mom's brain
Mm.
when the baby's in the
Yep.
womb. They're such a unit. Like there's I mean, we can go into a lot of these different aspects of shared neural coupling that happens through neuron synchronizing. So when the brain hasn't really formed any separations between the external and internal, then you have a lack of individuation. I mean, that's functional. It's just what happens afterwards when that individuation hasn't occurred at the in the right healthy developmental process, that's when you start getting issues. Clearly, right? As we can see, um, in not just in people, but even like when you look at brains at what their oxytocin and serotonergic systems are doing. So oxytocin that would have more to do with self-soothing, and serotonin with self-regulation states in general, and neurometabolic as well. So yeah, that's it, w- things start going wrong early, and then there's like from individuation you have personification, like becoming a person, and that's where like both parents do their job, and some in some senses the dad has a different role in setting boundaries and making you understand even the boundaries of your own selfhood, right? That comes later down the line, but you're building a persona, and you kind of see how these things come together. If these systems neurologically get damaged, if oxytocin and serotonin get damaged, or the mechanisms that make them up, then it can't do higher order integration of a selfhood or personhood, like you as your sense of self and identity. But that's also like you have a broken attachment either with one primary caretaker, both, but that doesn't stay with them. That's something that you have internally. So if we kind of like put a lot of this literature together on adverse childhood experiences, because a lot of people try to make it out as an acute thing. It's not. It can be chronic things as well, or a combination thereof, acute and chronic. Then that sets us up to understand that, yeah, like a lot of damage has been done in attachment. Ergo, a lot of damage is being done to people's ability and capacity to have let's say an integrated and a stable identity, right? Psychology.
Yeah, and I think you're right that the acute well, there's a couple of things. I mean, acute can be just a single instance, but can also be repetitive, acute insults over time that
Yeah.
sort of cause chronic issues. And I think
Mhm.
people don't fully appreciate. I think especially in America, there's such a shrugging of childhood abuse, and they don't realize sort of the damage that it causes. It actually causes physiological disruptions in the brain. For example,
Yes.
like the hippocampus is actually in chronic abuse victims damaged, right? So it actually
Yes.
has you have difficulty taking experiential data and
Mhm.
putting it in long term storage. That's why a lot of people like myself who had severe childhood trauma have just like missing pieces, just chunks gone from your memory. You have, a massive increase in the size of the amygdala, and people have a lot of anxiety and panic disorders and depression. And uh, it really causes, it's not just like a psychological thing. Oh, I've broken attachment, this sort of
Mhm.
like Instagram thing. Like, no, it's actually a deep physiological wound that causes, changes, like negative changes in the brain of a child.
Mhm. Yeah, it's like I sometimes I dislike using the term because of its implications, but it is actual brain damage, or at least it's maladaptive brain, changes that have occurred. Like that's not how your brain. I mean, it's doing what it's supposed to do in accordance to the environmental stimuli, but that's just as a response so that you could survive. But then you get out of that situation, right? I also don't have the best childhood, so I have had to understand a lot of this as well and work through that. It was like, okay, there's aspects of how I behave that had very little to do with who I think I am as a person, or as an identity, but that's just my all of these systems having been injured that left their traces. And for some people, again, it's a bell curve thing. Some people come out all the way, some people get very far, and then you have people that never gets as far or anywhere because the extent of the damage is so great.
Yeah, yeah, and that's one of the things that I hate hearing in America. I know I'm very American centric, but we're very big on spanking here. It's like if you don't hit your child, like you are somehow failing your child. It's pretty ghastly. But I hear a lot of defenders of it. It's like, oh, I got hit and I turned out just fine. A lot of people aren't aware that a lot of it's
Mm,
genetic dice. There's the warrior gene, and there's the worrier gene. Like that's
yeah.
one of the two large categories, and
Mm,
depending on which one you got, it determines your ability to withstand childhood
yeah.
trauma and recover from it. And it's like you did a great job of just managing your emotional states and overcoming your abuse. Like that's not what happened. Most likely, it is mostly just luck of the dice, and you're sitting here, spiking the football on somebody else who happen to roll a little bit shittier genetic hand than you.
Yeah. So the genes determining your neural blueprint, other factors in the environment, whether that's like in the your family unit or extended family or whatever, right? Or that even the parent that did the spanking was good at making repairs, or coming back to that, or any type of reconciliation afterwards. Like all those things are very important factors into how you perceive that. But also, like some people, as you said, like if that was adverse enough of an experience that they just kind of blocked it out, and then like, oh, it wasn't so bad back in the day, but it's like you're so far removed from that, right? The emotional uncoupling generally has already occurred, so you're not really the best judge on what the effect is of that when you're reasoning from a completely different vantage point now, right? Reference point.
Yeah, and I think what I hear when people say stuff like that is, I always conceptualize it as, I'm hearing the parent
Mhm.
embodying them or possessing them.
Right.
I'm like, it's the parent in their own head.
Yeah.
It's them having to deal with the fact that they were abused by their parent and they have to come to
Mhm.
grips with it. And instead of
Yeah.
actually internalizing it, this actually happened to me. This
Yeah.
was bad. I was hurt. What they do is they excuse the parent, and I just hear the parent channeling excuses through the person, and to me, that just makes me cringe, man. I don't like hearing that.
It's very fascinating that like that's something that I understood very late, neuroscientifically, even though I had an intuitive experience of that. And I think many people do, right? As you just pointed out, like there's a voice of the parent. So you have the term introject. It's a generative model, right? It's like you have a physical network of your parent, both of them, in your brain that is generating feedback. that is supposed to predict their movements, their moods, their behaviors, anything that, like, it's just pattern recognition, right? This is a model of that person that has its entire pattern prediction basis that is constantly signaling things to you. But in the, I can't remember who was the one that said it, but I think it's John Vervaeke who calls it the parasitic introject. So these can become parasitic, right? And that's what some of us will have experienced in how these voices come up in us that either, like, condone certain behaviors or disregard certain behaviors, or the way self-talk happens as well, right? When we go back to encoding profiles, so like the higher fidelity of an encoder you are, the more prominent or strong these voices are, right? Because they're so internalized as that introject would be, and the way your brain areas connect if you're very verbally fluent, or that the high verbal intelligence is there, then that center is going to connect, let's say, to that introject at a much higher level than for somebody else. um, so there's a level of like metacognition that has to do with this as well, because if you have a high level of self-awareness, you can kind of see like, oh, that's, or feel rather, that voice isn't you. It's not really your voice, or in certain cases not even your behavior, right? It's that parasitic introject doing certain things. So it's very aligned with what you're saying.
That's really interesting. And how do you conceptualize that differently than something like the authentic self? Whereas the same thing kind of happens, right? Let me just zoom out a little bit. What we are, as you mentioned, it's a product of our genetics. Like we
Mhm.
have these certain mechanisms and these programs that run in our brain. There's all these things that are sort of deterministically running in the background, or quasi deterministically.
Yeah.
But then there's your environment. There's all these things, the
Yes.
way you've been propagandized, these ideas that you've accepted from your culture and from the news and from, and it sort of infects your brain, and it sort of, without you even knowing it, shapes your worldview and shapes your mental models and how
Yeah.
you think of things. And it seems to be like the same concept that you just mentioned with respect to
Yes.
parents
Mhm.
happens at a more of a global scale. What are your thoughts on that?
So the way I look at it is this: I think all of that is adaptive. The problem that we're experiencing generally, right? And if we speak out of our experience, or me out of mine with like my adverse childhood experience, is that like those processes have a double edged blade, or it is a double edged blade, in terms that if that was bad parenting, or, like, in this case, whatever the parent did that was just not good for the child, then obviously that entire model that's supposed to represent them turns parasitic. If you like, I have a really good mother, right? So my mom is amazing. So that model is fine. Where like I don't experience any issues with that model. With my dad's model, that took a very long time to overcome. Um, and there's always aspects to be aware of. It's like I'm talking to myself again, and that comes from there, and like, okay, and then I can kind of place that. But just to make the point that, like, I don't think that as I often do, I don't think the actual mechanism at play is much of an issue. It's rather like what has happened to that particular mechanism. Because for each one of these layers, you can make the case that, like, that's actually a good thing if that is aligned with the well being and what we were saying before, like the sovereignty of a person. If all of these are healthy dynamics, like secure attachments between the culture, right, between your dad, your mom, your siblings, your peers, then all of these would be very beneficial, because you see that people that have had very good parents, they can kind of lean into that in times when they are alone and they can't reach out to the parent. Then they're like, oh, what would my dad say, or what would my dad do, what would my mom say to me, right? They can just kind of rely on that introject to kind of move them through a difficult period. That's why I think, like, or with the culture as well, or religion as well, it's not like they're, you know the John Vervaeke as well says, like, what makes you adaptive makes you vulnerable, but these introjects are adaptive, and because they're so adaptive, they are vulnerable, but they're very functional in every regard, that they bring us closer and further, like closer to ourselves in some regards, and further to where we want to go, in terms of personhood and sovereignty. It's just that, yeah, when we are unfortunate, whether it's with a parent, an environment, an experience, a religious experience, a spiritual experience, other peer groups, then that's gonna have a negative effect or a detrimental effect, right? Instead of more personhood, less personhood. Instead of bringing you further, it brings you back or down, right? Like I also grew up in a environment with guys that weren't very ambitious, lots of drugs, drinking, the whole nine yards. And like for me, that like I could notice, I also had to remove myself from that, but that was something that it doesn't bring you further, right, in life, and it doesn't make you more of who you are. Like we couldn't explore these elements together. So just to make the case for both angles.
Yeah, I get that, and that seems to be pretty prevalent in Europe. I've noticed that there seems to be, not every country's different, but a general sense that you don't want to. What's that old phrase? The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. Like
Yeah,
you don't want to
yeah,
step forward. I hear Chris Williamson talk about this all the time, and that's one of the reasons he left the UK. Is like, look, I
yeah,
was just
yeah.
around all these people, and in the UK, the culture was such that if you were successful, everybody tried to tear you down. It's like everybody wants to be equally poor, equally unsuccessful, equally lazy, because there's
Oh,
no like, if everyone is doing that, there's no reflection on yourself, right? If your peer group
yeah.
is like losers that are going out and getting drunk every night and they don't have a job, or they're, have a shitty job and they're not making very much money and they're just kind of surviving. And then that one person steps out and is really starting to excel and succeed, that casts a negative light on everyone around them. So there's this
Yeah.
like sort of cultural or social desire to like yank these people back down so we can all sort of suck together. Is that your experience?
Um, to a certain extent or a large extent, yeah. So there's definitely a crabs in the bucket mentality. That's the other
Yep.
analogy, right? Where the crab tries to bring the other crab back down. I'm fortunate in many ways that I, first of all, escaped that environment, and that when I moved to Oslo, Norway, which is where I'm still a Norwegian resident, that I found people like me, which is also like in general a quite a conformist place, Norway. So it's kind of funny, but I don't know. Like I've managed to find these across the world, even like I know guys like this almost anywhere. Maybe it's just birds of a feather type thing. I'm not quite sure. Well, a sort of coupling in general, that's the term for it, right? Like people that are alike will start seeking out other people that are alike. So in a long enough scale of time, it makes sense. But yeah, I did experience quite a fair amount of that here. But yeah, it's something that I managed to, for whatever reason, like it's difficult to differentiate, push away, and not get too caught up in, even though I could see um really the limitations, right, of the culture of, I mean, of every societal layer, and then what my peers were like, and that, yeah, we took very different roads. I still like know a lot of them from like almost 30 years ago or 20 years ago. And I'm fortunate that I've also come back and worked on these relationships and tried to bring them further ahead. So then that small group of them hasn't been an issue since that I've been back in Belgium for a while. So that's at least like a success story in that regard, right? That I try to like bring them out of that type of, it's beyond the mindset, but as you were saying before, like programming, right? There's definitely, so that comes back to where we started, that there's dangers to that, to the depth of internalization of the programs that you're given, right? Some of these can bring you further, right? Kind of what a lot of Europeans, in another sense, really like about the American mindsets in some ways, where it's like, just go, 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 bigger, better, build, build, build. And then, yeah, like if that's not a part of your culture or society, or the reverse, right? Then you're definitely limited or handicapped in some way by that internalization thereof of that specific layer.
Right, right. I completely see that.
Mm.
I want to circle back a little bit and talk about sovereignty. I know you know I'm big into individual sovereignty. I care deeply about it, and it's an interesting dynamic. And the more I think about this, when you were speaking, like the adaptive nature, especially of attachment, right? So I think of everything through this like libertarian lens, right? Like I think that's so important to me. As you know, ethics is super important. Not being violent with people is super important.
Hmm.
But I think there's sort of these dual adaptations that are at play that are in tension with each other. Whereas the libertarians like myself that are focused on individuals, I think a lot of us come from really shitty childhoods where the
Hmm.
tribe wasn't safe. Your
Yeah.
primary caretakers were
Hmm.
not safe. You had to turtle up and protect yourself. So there's this like uh, you're not looking at society as a safe thing
Hmm.
where and I think there's pros and cons to both of these. So, alternatively, the people that maybe grew up with secure attachment or more of a community or a better family or whatever will view the tribe as safe, and they will oftentimes. I think the mistake they make is they will take their, you know, smaller scale familial attachments and social attachments in their groups, their churches, their school, whatever it is, and then extrapolate that and at scale of the society, the
Yeah.
government to think,
Hmm.
oh, well, those are just essentially like
Yeah.
we talk about, you know, neuroscience, your inventory, your mental model, these sort of avatars that you construct,
Yeah.
you lazily and haphazardly apply the people that are close to you and who care about you, who you actually have a real relationship with. And you say, oh, well, you know, Donald Trump feels the exact same way about me as my father does.
Yeah.
And the government, they're just my family. They're looking out. And there's this sort of like pathological trust
Hmm.
and almost like the parents in the head sort of thing
Hmm.
where they're like, well, in excusing away, well, yeah, government, yeah, they're going to murder people and yeah, they're going to beat people, they're going to steal their money, but you know, they'll start wars, but it's okay, you know, like they make excuses, right? And I think we're the libertarians like myself, we're kind of like we're kind of like the canaries in the coal mine. We're trying to raise the alarm, being like, hey guys, your mental model is flawed. I'm not saying our mental model is perfect either. There's probably a synthesis of the two, but I do think those dual adaptive strategies couldn't be more pronounced than in the sort of realm of politics. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Um, Very similar to what we were talking about in the episode with Stewart, right? Where in systems that were not of that scope, all of this relational element where you were saying, right? Like, okay, my dad, that's the model that I'm prototyping, using that prototype as an extrapolation of like that's what the higher scales of society are doing. Um, it's not like I think there's probably a good reason why we call like priests like father.
Mm,
So it has a lot to do with that entire relational element because they were supposed to have the same function of bringing you further into personhood through these developmental phases. Look at like more of the ancient structures. I'm talking like Hellenic, right? That's more like my ballpark. I'm not saying that they were perfect. Spartan societies, that was kind of more the case. Like, yeah, well, my dad kind of had a thing to say because like he's part of the council or the this or the that, or you had all of this alignment in values. So I think a lot of these issues stem from the scale, but I think also that the ends of the spectrum, right? Kind of like we were saying that is represented in terms of these mental models and where you come from in terms of attachment and environment that influences things that are built on top of that, where those have drifted further and further and further and further and further apart. That also makes it difficult to reconcile because in a Heraclitean sense, there's always tension between oppositions and in a way they were supposed to balance themselves upwards, let's say. um but Europe in a lot of ways, and I can't really speak for, again, like the total embodiment or representation of Europe. It's a very fractured and very divided continent. But let's just say like a lot of Western Europeans like to give the American political system a lot of shit, but our political divides aren't much better. So whenever they say like, okay, like they're not in real opposition or like they're not collaborating in order to get anywhere, Belgium has been without a government at its longest for a year and a half. Like they couldn't reconcile anything, right? Like you see a lot of this happen with this coalition government. So all just to say that like I as I said last time, like I have a very hard time operating at that scale where you see the drift, but also the misalignment of values. And that, as you were saying before as well, when it's about like attacking people online, that a lot of people aren't looking to understand each other. But we don't have that in politics anyway, right? It's not like, for me at least, it doesn't seem that any party is trying to understand where another party is coming from. And then we need to add all of the monetary incentives, corruption, etc. So we're just kind of left with a, I would argue, a pretty big clusterfuck of like, well, okay, like I have a hard time trusting in these higher scales, also because of my background. But then when you find out, like anything from false flags to propaganda to whatever governments across the world have been doing, and where these actions have led us, then it's difficult to trust these guys. Like it's always also like, for me again, like trying to reason through it, like if there isn't attachment up this scale, um and you would want to have some type of coherence. If I use the Spartan model of a phalanx, like you are as an individual very important to the phalanx, like because you can't be the weakest link, but should you fall, we have another guy that can take your place. And that would be like, that's kind of like a good dynamic where you're still super important as a person, but if you fall away, the entire structure doesn't collapse. And maybe that would be a healthy model to think about how something like that could work. But like again, like how that would work at a scale, like you would have to have all of these systems back in, like feeding into these attachment models, right? Like how can I be attached to a governance? And I've had this since I've been very young. Like their values don't align with me. Oh, and their vision doesn't align with me. So like what type of attachment could I possibly have when I fall completely, generally, or like almost entirely out of the scope of a political system or ideology?
Yeah, and I don't think that they even oh God, maybe I'm just become too cynical, but my view of things is
Uh-huh.
that they don't even try anymore. Like it feels like everything that is done in the political realm, maybe it's different in Belgium, I don't know, but in America, it's like they've memeified
Hmm.
certain things. Like the political apparatus has amalgamated all of the things that work. They've done their polling, and they've figured out the sort of fake persona that they have to create, the avatar of a
Yeah.
human being that has to, during campaign times, have these, you know,
Kiss the
emotional
baby.
videos with a wet flag waving in the background and a bald eagle,
Mhm.
or maybe it's a Democrat with the, standing next to the guy working on building sidewalks, and I'm for the little guy. Like they've got these little memes that they've identified. They just roll them out every time there's an election cycle, and they post the same bullshit online. It's not a real person. There's no attachment. But I think what they're doing is it's like this perverted micro attachment. It's a thing that you gravitate towards. Do you know Helen Pluckrose? Do you know who that is?
What?
Do you know Helen Pluckrose?
No, I've never heard of her.
Oh my God, you need to look her up. So she's in the UK.
Uh,
She and James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian. I don't know if you know any of those people,
yeah, I
but
know Bogosian. I've heard Lindsay's name, but I'm not very familiar.
the three of them were behind the hoax papers, right? So they
Oh
did.
yeah, that story. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've heard about that. Hmm.
Helen is awesome. I went to the UK last year and I interviewed
Hmm.
her, and
Cool.
and she is an expert because she's a liberal, and so she's an expert in authoritarianism. She's constantly trying to push back against authoritarianism, and she's very keyed into the sort of mechanisms societally that underpin authoritarian societies. She talks about all of the things that must be true to want the strongman, to want the Donald Trump type of figure. But he's like a perfect example of that. Like there's just these sort of archetypes or these memes that I think the political system has figured out. Their PR teams have figured out how to make fake humans that sort of prick this sort of false perverted attachment, and they manipulate it
Nice.
now. And
Mhm.
it's, to me, it's so plainly obvious. But like I said, maybe I'm just cynical, maybe I'm just too old and I've seen too much. But what are your thoughts? You seeing the same thing? Do you think that's real?
I don't really know, to be honest. Like that's a lot of, so when it comes to European politics are some of our leaders, not all of them, or some of our politicians rather, they're, more humane. They're a little bit closer. I mean, Belgium's a population of like 12 million people. And I've lived in Norway most of my adult life, so I'm more familiar with the political system of Norway. I even worked a little bit in Stortinget, which is like the parliament, as a trainer, which is pretty funny. But Oslo is a pretty small place. It's like 500,000 people, so the chances of you just running into a politician or someone in politics is pretty big. That doesn't mean they're not constantly lying. They most certainly do a lot of that, and some of them are also connected to Brussels and the European Union and NATO. So it's I don't know to what degree that they're running the same scripts, but it, I understand that it's a function of degree. That a lot of it is just like mouthpiecing for whatever other interest is behind it, and then they just do things that are misaligned with the actual desires of the population. So there's definitely, a lot of fronting politicians to be something or another that they're really not, right? That definitely don't encapsulate who they are as a person. uh, Again, like it's to a similar degree. You have like Arbeidspartiet, it's like the Labor Party of Norway, right? That's fronted by somebody, but he's definitely not a representation of anything that has to do with labor. So what are we really talking about here, right? Like that, it's such a disconnect that so it's a lot of the same, but just like let's call it the maybe different expressions of these engineered archetypes or yeah, whatever leader types or whatever that gets people to buy into these political figureheads with a certain attachment.
Yeah, and I think that it's probably true. Like I said, I pay pretty close attention, and I see it, and I think there's probably something to that. But also, I realize that I got a fucked up childhood, and I'm not exactly the most well-adjusted person on the planet. But it just it angers me, right? Because somebody who has that broken attachment, the one thing you want is actual genuine human attachment.
Yeah.
And when you see somebody perverting it,
Mm.
especially for such nefarious ends, it tends to put you sideways a little bit.
Yeah, and there's something that we were talking about last time in that conversation with Stuart as well, is that down the line, like again, like I have no idea when this started happening. Maybe it's just been universal. You can kind of backtrack, but that these positions of power also tend to attract people that have certain types of complexes, also personality disorders, right? We can go from like sociopaths, psychopaths, narcissists, whether they're clinically whether that's a clinical diagnosis that is actually correct, that matters less than that they have strong gravitations towards these traits and behavioral patterns, right? There were like,
Hall monitor syndrome. That's one.
yeah, I
Have you
mean,
heard that before? Is that a European phrase? Are you familiar
it's
with?
it's not a European phrase, no.
Okay, so I mean, it's been popularized in meme format from The Simpsons, right?
Mhm.
And so if you get you're in elementary school and you become the hall monitor, you're the kid, right? You're part of the
Right, right,
class,
right. Yeah,
but
you get
they put the
yeah,
sash on and you get to
right,
stand
right,
in the hall.
right.
And now I have power and I can bust these other people. And I think what
I
you,
saw that in The Simpsons way back in the day. Yeah, then
yeah, yeah.
oh,
So
like now I'm on a power trip, right? So there is definitely the hall monitor effect. And that's been, Plato talks about it. I mean, both in the dialogues, in his letters, his disillusionment with the political climate was, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was also a thing why Solon, the lawgiver of Athens, effectively, I think he just disappeared or exiled himself. Um, so, like, I'm just trying to make the case that, like, down the line through history, we seem to have that gravitation of people towards these positions where and that's why I'm fascinated with history as well, in certain areas more than others, where you can kind of see like when they did it right, somebody was really concerned with their people and you know where that entire thing was going. That's why I use Lycurgus of Sparta very often, because he saw where things were about to head, with what ancient Sparta before it became the Sparta that we knew. And it was like, yeah, we're not doing that. We're gonna do this entire other thing. And despite the amount of opposition, pushed through and still created a very, a society that was very aligned in its values eventually, that persisted for a very long time. That's very impressive. Like, when I think about things in terms of culture that has spanned for quite some time, we're talking, hundreds and hundreds of years. Like, there's not a lot of them that you can find where you can find this much cohesion. I mean, we in Europe obviously has a lot of like a cultural inheritance, but it doesn't really reflect itself in the level of the states.
Have you heard of Brian Muraresku? Have you heard of Eleusis before?
No, I have not.
I'm gonna send you down the best rabbit hole, dude.
Okay, great.
So I love this because you're into the Greeks, right? And one of the things they had was all of the thinkers, all the major philosophers went to Eleusis. The political leaders of the time went to Eleusis, and they partook essentially of a psychedelic ritual.
In the mysteries, yeah, 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 yeah.
Yes, the mysteries,
Right,
exactly.
right,
Yeah,
yeah,
the
yeah.
mysteries of Eleusis. That's what it is. Eleusis is
That's
where
what
they
it is.
went.
Yeah, cool.
Eleusinian mysteries, I think, is actually what
Yeah.
it was. Yeah. So Brian Muraresku
Hmm.
is an awesome guy. He's a linguist, and he actually helped the Vatican do some archaeology because he was
Yeah,
looking at some of the texts, and he was very big into what they called mixed wine,
yeah.
which what he was looking at the actual text and found out this is actually probably a psychedelic brew. And he had very strong suspicions that the early Christian church
Hmm.
was actually partaking of the same thing as the mysteries of Eleusis, right? So he ended up going to the Vatican, went to the archives, found a bunch of texts, went and did some archaeological digs, and found early Christian churches and found the communion cups, and had them chemically analyzed and found out that it's full of ergotine, which
Oh
is
God.
the basis for LSD, right? And so he's sort of anyway. If you want to go down a rabbit hole, but I want pivoting back, like I think
Yeah.
the concept is important. Is that I think the psychopaths that you rightly call out that take political office for power and stuff, I think they should have to do like trip their face off, send them to Costa Rica, have them do an
Yeah.
ayahuasca ceremony or something. Because I
Yeah.
think that might help cure some of that. Because some of these people, I think they're definitely psychopaths, definitely NPCs, and really out for themselves. And boy, I think we'd have a different world of people that had that power actually had to confront something that transcendent and mystical. I'm not sure if you had any experiences like that, but I have, and I
Um,
definitely know it's transformative.
I've had spiritual or mystical experiences without psychedelics, actually. So apparently, I'm one of the very few. Um,
Well, you said you're sort of constructed that way, right? Like,
yeah, I believe it has something to do with the hyperphantasia, and then like my dopamine, so all systems and whatever my brain can do in terms of generating, right? So like again, like I me as an identity, as a person, like I like this was not something that I concocted. That's just something that I have access to. I'm fortunate in that sense. So the first time that I did any psychedelics wasn't even that interesting to me because I was like, well, that's not really didn't really get me anywhere.
did
I
you
had
do enough?
already, but
Did you take enough?
I took enough, yeah. Like it was a bit of a funny story. This long story short, we were on a work trip, with me and two other clients, and we had like this psychedelic chocolate, like Blue Lotus, and we weren't really sure. We didn't really do our due diligence, and I took like 4 tabs, which was like a heroic dose. I was like, oh, like this is very weird. Weird things are happening, but like I didn't have a very spiritual experience at all.
Mm.
It was more that due to my ability to model things at a very high level, again, my brain, things that I've read, lots of. It's also inherent in coaching, where you learn how to model other people's world experiences. Doesn't mean you always get it right. Obviously, there's room for error, but you make all of these different predictions and models. So with the hyperphantasia, I've been able to do a lot of that. So the most notable thing about that experience was that I was able to go like, oh yeah, like when other people like had the visuals like that, when I saw things of Tool, for instance, and I kind of saw something similar, I was like, oh yeah, okay, that looks like that, and then this happened, and that was what this person said. So I was able to contrast all these things with like miniature models as representations of the experience. But then this thing was, the experience on steroids, and it wasn't really necessary for me in that regard. But I do agree that, again, it's kind of this thing where when brains work in the way that they do, when you can't get access to certain parts or systems, right, or even capacities that leading people through, um, people that are prepared, usually, right. I kind of like to preface that I think there's a lot of pre-integration, like you do some work on archetypes so that you kind of understand the thing that you're meeting, or that you at least have an idea of what might be coming up, right? And that you have a good facilitator, and then a lot of post work so that there's integration. And I guess I believe, right? Like if we put it back into the old Greek um, system of the way these mysteries happened, from what I know from it, all of it was also encased in the Greek mythology and cosmology. So I believe, can be wrong, that when you would meet an entity that either is actually something external to whatever degree, that people experience that, or something internal, then at least that would have been like represented by something that you understood. Like, this is Hades, this is Ares, this is, I don't know, whatever, a guiding spirit, this is my ancestor. But when people now take psychedelics, and then especially disconnected from the mythology, the culture, the cosmology, and you don't have any real models to pin these things on, I think that's where a lot of things go sideways. So
Yeah,
that's
I
a
I would
concern.
agree, and all of the literature seems to indicate that psychedelics need a container.
Mhm,
You have to, and that's why, like, like I mentioned Costa Rica, the ayahuasca ceremony, like, you go there and there's this certain protocol, right? Everybody sits around in the jungle, and you have the ayahuasquera, the shaman that's leading the
mhm,
ceremony, and you're banging the drums, and there's this music playing, and there's this chanting in the and like all of this is the container
mhm.
for the experience. And I think without that container, you sort of drift off into the ether. At
Yeah.
least at least a lot of people can, and then I don't think psychedelics go bad a whole bunch of times, but
Mhm.
if you've ever had a bad trip or a negative experience on psychedelics, you realize that it can go very, very wrong, and it's a very unpleasant experience.
Yeah, and that's, when it comes to back to these like scales of attachment, or the way like societies have been built, like when you have a governing body like the illusion mysteries, then there's a selection process, right, that happens beforehand, kind of like if a shaman in a, I don't know, a town or a tribe could kind of tell, like, okay, you're not really there yet. Let's keep working on other things. Then that makes a lot of sense to me, and it kind of speaks to this like fragmentation and isolation and disconnection that we've been kind of like runs as a theme throughout this conversation, and it's inverse, right? The integration and attachment and connection, where, yeah, I think a lot more like that has to occur at different scales. And that would also seems to mimic a lot of these older societal models more than the modern ones that we have. Um, and our grievances with politics of the modern day as well.
I want to go back a little bit.
Mm.
So you said that you've had spiritual, transcendent, whatever mystical type experiences in the absence of psychedelics. So I'd like to have you talk to me about like how you get yourself there. Is that just like you can sort of turn this on, or is it like meditation and breath work? Is there a protocol that you follow?
Um, so I can outline the things that I know, and I can kind of make a certain assumptions about the things that I don't really know. I've done a lot of different forms of meditation and a lot of different forms of breath work, which I think facilitated this strongly. Um, I've also been working across the psychological dimensions of, well, the integration of these archetypes, understanding what they are or what they mean to me, getting their representatives, so to say, like the ones that stand out to me, that mean something, or that are an embodiment of an aspect of self. Um, I've also done like different like psychosomatic trauma releases. I've done um also like with a functional neurologist, like we did all of this like brain stuff. Um, so I when I put all of these things together, I think those were the things that led me there. Um, so sometimes that then if I'm meditating or at certain breathwork protocols, then you have like, the stereotypical experience of like unity and wholeness or oneness with the universe. And I had that very early on in my meditation journey. Must have been somewhere in like 2019 or something, maybe 18, around that time when I was meditating a lot. And then I had that like ultimate oneness experience. And, they were like, whoa, that's your sense of self exists at the scale of the universe or, merges with it. There's still that element that I was like, I'm still me, but you're just feel at one with the entire scale that you have access to. That was very fascinating, and I did, yeah. I
Yeah, so
went in.
you still had a sense of identity at the time?
Well, I had a intuitive understanding that like my body was still mine, because I could feel this thing, but then at the same time, it's kind of like your head is extending into the cosmos, right? I think maybe that's why that like the representation of the art always does that type of thing as
Mhm.
well. So like that's I think the best way to relate it.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is because I had similar, but it was always mediated by psychedelics, and I
Mhm.
had a quote unquote ego death experience, very similar to what you're talking about, and I could almost hear my default mode network just click off to
Uh,
the point where I didn't know my name.
mhm.
I didn't sort of have a concept of me as me anymore, and you just
Yeah,
sort of blended into the entire universe, and it's a
yeah,
very difficult experience to describe verbally
yeah, yeah.
because it doesn't make any sense. But I was just wondering, like, how what your experience was. 'Cause I've heard also that long term meditators can get to that state just through meditation. But
So
I was just wondering what the contrast was between the two.
um, I think the contrast is in degree of porousness of this boundary between the self and the universe. So like I think the psychedelics enforce the dissolvement of that boundary, right, temporarily, which is good, right? In these cases, when the road there is filled with more obstacles to do it naturally, because I don't have obviously any issues with people using psychedelics in this way. So that's still a natural approach, if you want to call it like that, an enhanced approach. So um, I've with all of this meditation, and it also depends on my state, by the way. It's not like I always have access to that. It definitely the environment plays a big role when I'm in Bali, for instance, for work, when I'm in also living my life. I have a lot more access to these types of things. It's far more difficult here in Belgium, different reasons. So to kind of make the point about the default mode network and the self-referential processing and what I mentioned in the beginning about like the amplitude or the amount of monologue or dialogue that goes on. That was one thing where meditation, state, and environment really comes together, where I can just turn that off um on the will, basically. Like, okay, like I can just stop my default mode network, my DMN, whenever I'm in those types of states. So I need to be in a pretty decent state, neurophysiologically, and then in being an environment that can facilitate that. So there's a degree of control there, which is great, right? That a pretty wide margin where I'm still aware that I'm me. It's just that there's nothing running there. It's just like pure presence. Doesn't always mean or imply like a cosmic, consciousness or experience thereof. It just means that like right now I'm not monologuing or dialoguing. I'm not thinking about anything. I'm just sitting here being present and enjoying the whatever circumstances, the state, both of them. So that's been a very convenient aspect of doing all of this these drills or these practices.
Got it. How long you been meditating for?
On and off, say around the same time. No, it's even earlier. Since I was, I think, like 14, 15. Yeah. So give or take 20 years.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely long term. So what benefits have you seen from meditation?
Um, I mean, to be honest, like a lot of them, kind of feel like they've just. th- I'm used to these states and these things being the case that I kind of take it for granted, and the contrast is faded in the background. Uh, so I would say that if I try to think back, I think a lot more of the self-referential processing, and if not regulating states, at least being aware of the landscape of these states, or like the landscape of my emotions, right? Before they were a little more undifferentiated. Like the topography was off, like it didn't have a lot of detail. If you think about it like a 3D map, right, it was very undifferentiated and vague. I think meditation also really helped with that, where you can kind of like get a much better sense of your emotional landscape and your state landscape. Like, okay, where am I? Like, I have a lot of very strong interoceptive feedback, but that doesn't mean that I can differentiate everything that comes in. Meditation, that was one of the things where you really start broadening that spectrum of not just being able to tap into them, but also like categorizing, right? Like it automatically kind of does that, or sort of. You still need to practice it to a certain degree. And that's what I meant with the defining of the topography of that landscape of states. That's where I really got like um well, a lot of benefit, a lot of value, where I could kind of pinpoint these, like, I'm feeling like that. Okay, now I kind of get it. Like, you don't waste that time or really energy, right? Like being or feeling confused about like what this feeling is, like what am I supposed to do with it? That was, I would argue, one of the main benefits.
Got it. So it's more like just the paying attention piece of meditation keeps you present and connected, as opposed to maybe somebody's going through their life and some stuff is like latent and bubbling up under the surface. They're not technically aware that it's happening until it turns into a full blown crisis. And then
Yeah,
they start to look like, oh my gosh, what's going on
yeah,
with me emotionally, doing the inventory and be like, oh, you're kind of like doing that all the time. So you don't feel a need to, or stuff doesn't get away with you, get away from you so much, maybe.
yeah. It's like it broadens that spotlight of your interoceptive capabilities, right? Like the capability you have to first detect and then differentiate or understand, interpret the biofeedback that comes in.
Got it. That totally makes sense. Getting a little bit short on time, so I wanted to ask you something. Is like, what's the thing that's on your frontier right now? Like, what are you delving into that you think is super important that you're ahead of the curve on, or most people aren't paying attention to right now?
Um, I think it actually is where we started the conversation about these encoding profiles, because I think, like, from an attachment level, let's say it, I think it's easier to understand other people, maybe not necessarily connect to them, but just understand, and we're like, okay, understand why you can't experience things in the way that I am experiencing them, or why you don't, right? Or why this thing isn't salient to you, why it doesn't stand out, why it doesn't have any, real valence, like why it's just neutral to you, maybe, or you just don't care about it at all. Which would be apathy in that regard. So I think that's the thing. Like, I'm writing a book about it right now, which would be tying together intuition, interoception, so biofeedback and emotion. And it goes through these scales of consciousness. It goes through all of this like interoceptive work, right? Body, like all the neuroscience about like how brains are constructed. Not all of it, a lot of it, let's say, just to kind of make sense of this piece. Um, but mainly, it's like I'm brought up in a Catholic environment, household, society. My dad is Romanian, so I will have a little bit of orthodoxy in there, but that was never really something that I related to many degrees or at all, and a lot of the expression I never really found. Yeah, that connected with me, never really resonated. So I kind of had to find my way through to, like, what would praying look like to me? What is these divine, or like the scale of consciousness in the metaphysical? What does that look like to me? Like, how can I represent that into a model that makes it easier for people that also are in the same circumstances, right? That came from similar backgrounds that aren't as fortunate to, um, let's say, like, yeah, just could grasp that idea of God that is presented by the different churches or different religions that they just don't connect to. So, I mean, that's what I'm working with now. And I think that that book in that way might offer a benefit from both of these angles.
Oh, that's interesting, man. That's like I'm patient zero. I need to read that book. That sounds exactly like me. How did you conceptualize this? Because obviously there's a disconnection from your traditions with
Mm,
Catholicism and maybe some of these other structures that have emerged. And I think we all like I always struggle when trying to get to ground truth on things and trying to understand things and develop better mental models. There's sort of this dichotomy with rejecting tradition.
uh,
It's like the throw the baby out with the bathwater thing. There's
yeah, exactly.
obviously like some really great stuff that's embedded in
Mm,
all the religious traditions and the
mhm.
collective wisdom of society. How did you balance sort of like incorporating that while also rejecting the stuff that didn't make any sense when you're coming up with your framework?
I also want to state that a lot of my framework isn't like mine, right? Technically meaning that a lot of it actually came from Plato and later Neoplatonism. So I like seeing that there are things in Catholicism that I enjoyed or could see the benefit of that I was like, okay, that's good. Admittedly, this is good stuff. And a lot of things where I was like, hey, that doesn't work. Same in orthodoxy. Then I went into Eastern philosophy through like Alan Watts. Then I got to Western philosophy through Stoicism. And then I got to Platonism. And then I was already adding the psychology and the neuroscience on top of that. In Plato, that's where things just clicked for me. Because that was the first time where I read something of the metaphysical kind where I was like, okay, cool. This works. I got it. Like, I'm happy. Like, this I can work with. Um, so that's my entry. I basically like I don't tend to use much identifiers, but if I would place myself anywhere, I guess I'm a Platonist at the heart. A lot of it's like when I read it, just made complete sense. Where I was like, okay, cool, like that's very close to the way I see the world, to the way I experience things, to like my capacities, and then building on the work of the um Stoics, which and not actually, the modern stuff. I mean, the actual um, source material, where they also talk about the spiritual or the religious element that was in Stoicism that never makes it in the modern versions. So that was important to me. That when I read that, that was kind of the first clue because a lot of it comes from Platonism anyway. I was like, okay, there is that, like these mystical, sacred, spiritual experiences, religious experiences that I've had, and look here, they're just talking about the same thing 2000 years ago, right? So I wasn't off base. And that helped me construe or construct these both the patterns and the practices to kind of put that together in that model, which is it's if we're gonna be very precise, it's just an updated version of Plato. It's just a modernized Platonic framework, really. But it's just added in the neuroscience, the psychology, modern physics, a lot of the things that Stewart has talked about in terms of the work of Dr. Michael Levin. That's in there, right? Like a lot of the Platonic morphospace. So yeah, I'm just trying to tie it together into a model that is coherent and cohesive without making any grand claims about religion or anything of the sort, right? So for me, God is still on top of that hierarchy. I just got to it from a different angle, without completely rejecting my Christian heritage.
Got it. Wow. I have to have you back, man, because I am not a fan of Plato. I mean, no, sorry,
Wow,
I'm not. Okay, okay. I'm
you
a
break my
fan of
heart.
Plato in
Um,
some regards. I guess when we get to the world of the realm of forms and that sort of stuff, you lose me a little bit. But I'm an open-minded skeptic, and I'm open to having my mind changed. I also think that it's interesting that you're overlaying the neuroscience as well as your experiential just what your subjective experience is and sort of triangulating around those. So we're out of time today, man, but I will have to delve into it. I got to have you back, man. I love talking to you, brother. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Why don't you tell everybody where they can find you?
You can find me on X. That's basically where I spend all of my social media energy and time. So that's at Sim Van Dale, Daele. And yeah, that's where you can connect with me.
All right, man. Thank you so much, man. Chat later.
Thank you for having me on, man. I really appreciated it.
Yes, sir.